Hi, everybody. I am Eli Moss, and we are here tonight for the From Survival to Sanctuary series. This is the third in this first part of the series that has been co-produced by my studio, Autonomous Mechanics, here based in New York City, as well as by the Center for the Advancement of Public Action at Bennington College, where I have been a fellow for the last 2 years. And I am so excited for this roundtable tonight with my incredible guests, Kapley Kalnick, Dina Janis, and Micah Busey. And we also have quite a few of my students who are all in advanced tutorials with me this year, who have been members of a variety of seminars and projects that I've been doing at Bennington for the last couple of years. So I'm just so excited to have us here tonight. And we're just going to start with a couple of kind of just like access notes and logistics and some thank yous. Obviously, the first thank yous to my incredible guests. Thank you so much to Bennington and to Kappa for helping produce this. Thank you to Susan Scorbati, who is here and who will, in a couple of minutes, tell you guys a little bit more about the amazing work that Kappa does. And also shout outs to Kelly in the office at Kappa, and also to Kira, my wonderful fellow Swarthmore alum in the communications office at Bennington, who has gleefully guided me through being someone learning Drupal on the fly to get all this stuff up on the communications end at Bennington. As I've already told the audience here, there's a couple of access things to be aware of tonight. In addition to the fact that there are closed captions, which are available for the guests and the live audience, they will also be in the videos. Myself and the other guests here will be doing visual descriptions for you. You will see that happen when we introduce ourselves later. And so for anyone who is visually impaired and watching this, you will have a little bit of a description about what it looks like to be looking at us tonight. And a full audio version of this will be available on Substack, as will a full transcript, notes, and links. So just a couple of things. Tonight will basically be a facilitated conversation to which these guests and then some of my students are also invited, but also to which you as an audience member are invited. The chat is a really amazing place to keep that going. So I invite you, if you're a member of this audience, to add things in the chat as we are going. The last couple of events have had extremely vibrant chats with people sharing links, whether they're a guest, when they're not talking, and I'll be sharing links throughout as well. And if you registered for this event, you will be getting sort of a follow-up with a link to the Substack with the archive and all of those great links. And you can also share and save and share the chat yourself at the end. And I will make sure that you have an opportunity to do that. People were like following anxiously along last time as things fired through, and it's been very exciting. So I will be timing and sort of facilitating tonight. We've got a lot of people to talk, and I could talk to any of these people and have for the amount of time that we have for all of us to talk together. So I'll be doing a little bit of timing and I'll be really facilitating the conversation. Our conversation will really go until just about 9 o'clock, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So the whole event will really go until just about 9:30. Of course, if you need to leave before then, audience, understood, and you can watch it later. What else? So just a couple of things about like what this series is, right? What is the goal of the From Survival to Sanctuary series? So these are conversations meant for everybody, anybody who's kind of asking ourselves right now, like what kind of futures we can expect and how we get ourselves there in a not abstract way, how we actually move our bodies, our communities, our families, our selves, our institutions, our physical environment into the space. And specifically, one of the challenges that I know I face and that I think a lot of us face is that we find ourselves in a state of having learned what it means to survive. And our bodies have learned what it means to survive. And we're sort of like dealing with that all the time when we're kind of offering ourselves new futures that maybe ask us to operate in a way that our body says, that's not safe, but it may be the only thing that's safe, right? So how do we get ourselves over that hurdle? And so these are conversations which I invite in people from all sorts of different disciplines, and maybe people that you don't think would be the person to answer that question. And yet they're all folks who have found their way to their practices through different approaches to these questions, maybe some intentional, maybe some not, right? And so this is a series that is ongoing. It's sort of about to be a road show. It's going to be taken on the road. It will be popping up in a variety of community spaces, institutions, libraries, galleries. It will continue to be online. It also will continue to exist as a podcast where I'm going to continue to do conversations with people. And so you, listener, person in the audience, someone listening on Substack in a couple of years, I don't know, you are welcome to reach out and be like, come to my school, come to my church, come to my community group. I really want to do this topic. Let's talk about it. So invitation is open. So as I said before, tonight we are sponsored by Autonomous Mechanics and APA. And so my dear friend and collaborator and advisor, Susan Scorbati, is going to be pinned alongside the rest of us and is going to tell you a little bit about what CAPA does.
Thank you, Eli. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you could all be here tonight. I wanted to just say very briefly a couple words about the Center for the Advancement of Public Action, and then turn it back over to Eli. I'm Susan Scorbati, the director of what we call CAPA, and our main initiatives right now are human rights and peace building. And under each of these, we do a lot of different types of courses, projects, like forced migration, a curriculum and education program for maximum security prison came out of CAPA several years ago. And we have international partners, particularly with human rights and peace building area. We also have a project that is focused specifically on activating democracy, a moment that's, very, very important, I think, for the United States and all around the world. Excuse me. Also the environment, food, water, and energy. We've done some access to water quality as a human right and renewable energy. Art and public action is also a big area that artists who really want to work in their communities to make their communities a stronger place, and a new initiative called Building Regenerative and Resilient Communities. And this is really an area of students, but really anyone who wants to imagine. This is a little bit, I think, also what Eli has been really focusing on. How can we imagine the world we want to live in the future, and what do our communities look like, and how do we build them? So with that, I just want to say that, one of the things we're really committed to is dialogue, particularly at this moment where it's so important, I think, for us to respect and share different perspectives. And sometimes that's not easy. It can be difficult. But I think it's really so important. And, I feel like the series and what Eli's trying to do is really to bring people together to learn from each other and to share currently what's on their mind and what they're thinking about. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Eli, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I'm trying to get Susan to do a conversation with me pretty soon about some of what she was just bringing up about kind of like how we have dialogue and what that looks like. And you should all know what Susan's work is about too, because she's a brilliant person. All right. So before we go any further, I want to do a land acknowledgement, which I think is really important for all of us to practice. So as I said, this event is hosted by me, Eli Moss, and my design studio, Autonomous Mechanics, along with the Center for Public Action at Bennington College. Myself and our guests tonight and my studio are mostly based in Lenape-Hochig, the unceded land of the Munsee, Lenni Lenape, and Canarsie people, now New York City. And CAPA is located on what is now known as Southern Vermont on the unceded land of the Abenaki and Mohegan peoples. These are both on Turtle Island. We ask you to join us in acknowledging the Lenape, Abenaki, and Mohegan communities, their elders past and present, and future generations. We also acknowledge that many arts and educational institutions with which we work have been founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose lands these organizations occupy. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And if you are interested in creating protocols for your organization or practice, I have a really great link that I'm just going to put in the chat. And this wonderful group of organizers who are primarily from various Indigenous communities in the United States have put together this guide, and it is in the chat for you. So tonight and our themes, as you know, our topic for tonight has been called Queering Third Spaces and Blueprinting Futures of Care. And, you know, as I was talking to someone about this event today, she was like, I don't know, I've got this friend and I'm going to be with her at the time and I don't think she's going to like it. And I was like, why? It's for everybody. And I was like, is that language? I was like, it's the language, isn't it? You know, I mean, this is part of a larger project that I call speculative solidarity. Is what am I even saying? Why do I use language like this? Right. And so, you know, it's part of a practice for me, which is part of something larger called a disruptor mechanism protocol. Again, it sounds crazy, I know, but what it is a way of using language to move us into spaces that maybe aren't familiar so that we can call them and think of them in different ways, right? So they're not necessarily the language that we know. However, there's a hurdle to make that language feel safe and accessible, right? So I say queering and you're like, but I'm not queer. Can I come to this? Yes. Right. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And what does it mean to be blueprinting futures, you know, futures of care with people? It's like, but these aren't doctors. Like, well, we got one reverend, but like, I don't even feel safe in a church. And like, what are these theater artists going to talk about care? Like, why don't you have like, you know? But that's part of the thing. We all got here in different ways, and I do see this as work that we're all doing, right? So, who are the right guests for each question? In a way, all of us are the right guests. Everyone in the audience is the right guest, because we're all asking these questions in our own ways, whether or not we've named them, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is kind of name them and be like, hey, this language that I'm using, let's name that it feels weird and talk about it, and see if you can understand the strategy without feeling uncomfortable, because so often it's actually about feeling like you're not welcome somewhere where language that you're not familiar with is being used. And so many of us have had an experience, which is something that I don't love about academia, where someone uses language and you come in the room and they're like, oh, why don't you know this? So I really try to practice an opposite thing, right? So hopefully you'll find that tonight. And we'll talk about all of these words. So before we get into the questions, we're going to give you some intros to who is here and why it is that we're here. So I'll start with myself and I'll also model a visual description. And we're not going to do formal bios tonight. Everyone is going to introduce themselves the way that they want. And they can tell you who they are. And they can tell you as much or as little as they want. So I am Eli Moss. My pronouns are they, he, and Z. I am an olive-skinned, white-bodied person. I am wearing green glasses that are sort of reflective, but it helps me see. And I have a public media, WBGO, beige baseball cap on my head, sort of tilted back. I've got brown and increasingly graying bangs sort of to the side, a gray, this is not a blazer. I almost said blazer. I so often have a blazer. This is a, what is it? A cardigan over a sort of printed shirt. We've got some necklaces as often, and there's lots of books behind me, shocking, and some instruments to the side. And I am a research-based social practice artist and organizer and community builder. I sometimes call myself a systems doula. Sometimes I call myself a organism learning how to person. I teach in schools, I work in schools, I think about institutions and how both endearing and problematic they are. And I work across a lot of mediums, and my primary medium for many years has been questions, just like you're getting tonight. And I will pass it to Kaylee.
Hello. Good evening. Hi, I'm Capely. I'm Capely Kalnick, and my pronouns are they and them. So for a visual description, I am a chocolate brown-skinned, black, queer, trans, masculine, gender expansive, non-binary person with chin length, shaggy, black violet braids. I've got gray rectangular glasses on, a gold septum ring, and a little goatee hair and freckles across my nose. I'm wearing a black button-down shirt, and I'm in my living room, gray background, some instruments, some plants, a window. Okay, so I am an actor, a director, an aerialist. I teach writing workshops. I do audiobooks. I, think about life. I have a beautiful social construct, like a social enterprise called Black Acrobat, where I investigate Blackness and queerness and mental health within my productions. And I also, what else can I share? Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. There's so much to share. I hope it all comes out tonight. I'm going to pass this on to Dina.
Hi, thank you, Kipali. I'm Dina Janis. I am a white Welsh background woman in my very messy office in Vermont with the end of the day in the forest behind me in the windows. My hair is kind of a light brown and it's shoulder length. Um, I am pretty basic today. I have a black button-down shirt, no makeup, just kind of uh, simple. um, what else can I tell you about myself? I have gold earrings on, little hoops that I always wear, and a gold chain. I am an actor also and a director. I have produced theater throughout my life, and I'm also a mother of two sons and a wife and a teacher. I teach at Bennington College where Kappa is. So I've been teaching at Bennington for I guess it's almost 23 years now, which is kind of mind blowing. But I'm originally a New York based person. So New York was really still my home in my heart. So I think that's basically all there is to say about me for now. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and always find Eli bringing people together with such curiosity and kindness. So it's an honor to be part of this. Thank you.
Micah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Micah. My pronouns are they and them, and I am coming to you from Greenwich Village in my office at Judson Memorial Church, where I serve as the senior minister of a wonderful congregation of about 235-ish formal congregants, but a building that houses not only the gatherings of that congregation, but also tons of social justice and collective liberation gatherings, lots and lots of artists and art gatherings. Describe myself. Okay, I am a white-bodied person who has really, really spiky big hair that kind of looks like a lion's mane that is about to be pruned a bit on Thursday, and I can't wait for that because I'm using a lot of product right now. I've got a beard and a mustache. I have a plaid shirt. I typically wear plaid every day in some form, and this is one of my classic shirts. Probably I've worn this a few days this week, so it's got like my scent good in there as well. And I also have purple and white glitter nail polish on my fingers, which remind me that I need to continually be queering myself. Whenever I look down at them, whenever I think that I need to fit into some binaries, I look down at these glittery fingernails and they tell me that I can be more than I think I am. I like to describe myself as a passionately radical faith leader, a flaming fairy, and an enthusiastic fan. My queer agenda is basically to nurture curiosity and artistry in everyone. I think of artists as modern day prophets because they show us where we've been, they show us who we are, and they show us what we can become. And so I love essentially affirming artists and their prophetic voices and their potential for serving as co-creative forces that point us toward horizons that we never thought we could go toward. And also I love basically crafting rituals and prayers and spells and all kinds of things that might look like they belong in a church and that some people would think don't belong in a church at all, and everything in between. And I am also just enthusiastic about learning all the time. So I'm grateful to be in a place where I will be learning from all of you tonight, and I can't wait.
Well, I'm so excited that all of you are here. And now we're going to spend 1 minute where I'm going to bring my students on to just say hi. And they're not going to have to do what we all did, but I'm just going to bring them up on the screen. So we've got Will, Stella, Molly, and Abby. And so I'm just going to pin these nice folks and they're going to come on. Stella. Will, you're on screen, just so you know. So we've got Will, Stella, there's Molly, and Abby. And they're just going to give you a little wave. I don't know what happened to Will, but Will's there. So Stella, Molly, and Abby were all part of my archive and access publication as a mutual aid and publication as a public action. And it was about sort of like mutual aid and radical practice in the fall. And they became part of a sort of urgent action working group. And we did some really beautiful projects, and they created some wonderful zines and other materials about Palestine, and we're part of building a reading room. And then we set up a advanced tutorial for them this semester, and they have been putting together a sort of Bennington free press. And so if you guys want to say hi, and if any of you want to say a couple of words about what you've been doing, you are welcome to do so. You don't have to do the full introduction or the visual descriptions. That's okay. Does someone want to say a couple words? Or I can do it, but I'm giving you the option first. You can at least wave and say hi.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Molly. Are you all being shy? Do you need me to do it? Stella, not your way to be shy. All right. So they have been putting together this wonderful free press, and we have had a really interesting semester. We also have another person who's sort of largely in our tutorial, who is Santiago Jenkins, who cannot be here tonight because they have a show and are in rehearsal today, but they have been building a time bank as part of their project as well. And Will, I don't know if Will has like left the room for a minute. They have just come back from Africa, so it's totally possible they just like fell asleep. So it's possible. But so we have been putting together a free press this semester, and Molly, Abby, and Stella have also been sort of just negotiating and recognizing all the challenges of what it means to sort of like put together a press, just the logistics and the design and like what it means to create it digitally, physically, and also just like what it kind of means to work in and against institutions. So I'll ask you guys to maybe say a couple words later when we're deeper in the things, but I just wanted to bring them on camera and say hi. Will, who is a mystery to us right now, has been doing a Queering Third Spaces tutorial with me and was a member of my year one Seed Lab last spring and involved in a variety of public actions at the Left Bank Gallery in North Bennington. So thank you, students, for being here. And you aren't forced to say anything, but if you want to add to the conversation later, I will give you opportunities to do so. Okay. All right. So I'm going to unpin these Wonderful folks. We are back to our main chat. Oh gosh. Okay. Oh, technology. All right. So onward. So we're going to start with just kind of the language, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of queering. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of third spaces. And I'm primarily asking these folks, but I also want to open up to the audience. And if anyone's like, yes, yes, me, you're welcome to come on. But luckily, I've got these three people who actually have to answer the question if no one else, offers. But I wanted to ask the audience what the word sort of third space or third place means to you. Are you familiar with that? Is that a phrase that you know, or what does it mean to you? Does someone sort of know what that is? You're welcome to put it in the chat. You're welcome to raise your hand. I'm going to ask the audience first, and if not, I will go to my guests. Third place, third space, are these the same thing? Remains to be seen. Audience? No. Audience members, I know so many of you, you're lucky I don't call on you individually. Guests, third place, third space. What do you think?
I definitely know what a third space is. I think I don't know that I can comment on what the difference is between a third place and a third space is, although maybe I would argue that one of them is a place where you actually feel belonging, and the other is a place where belonging might remain in question. I think as the senior minister of a church, I think churches for a long time, along with being a lot of icky things as well, that I'm sure we'll dive into in terms of the harm that religion and Christianity and church have done, they've also acted as in-between places where you are not at work, you are not at home, you are in a space where you have a sense of belonging with a community, and it is not a place that is sapping you of energy so that you can exist in a capitalistic system, and it's also not the respite home where you sleep at night. Instead, it is a place where you go to have a sense that you are a part of a community that is pouring energy in, and also hopefully getting nourishment out of this in-between space between work and home.
There we go. Capely or Dina, anything to add? I'm going to read what folks have said in the chat. So some people said, I'm not familiar. Some people said something in between, something outside of a binary. Keen says that this implies that there is a first and second space. What are those for space and place? So Dina, and I've also put some links in the chat to kind of disambiguate between the two, which I will talk about in a minute. But Dina or Capely, anything that sort of like these things mean for you? Dina, go ahead.
Yeah, being someone who, I guess for me, it's a communal space. Being someone who's spent so much of my life in a theater or in theaters, which I see a really strong connection to a church space. To me, it's like the theater is sort of my version of that. But it's a space that may or may not welcome everyone, but it certainly is a place where community can come together from various different homes, places, and sometimes it's around a shared activity or something that draws people together. So for me, I think also growing up, I grew up in my parents were both jazz musicians, and I think a lot about just how much those spaces in which music happened and people came together to improvise and play and often travel together, that it isn't necessarily bound to a specific place in my mind. But in other words, I think that third space can happen in a way that's a bit it can be a movable place. But that's my understanding of it, not knowing exactly what the clear definition is. Yeah.
Capely, you want to have a go?
I had to look it up. I wasn't quite sure what that was, but I had a hypothesis and I was correct. But yeah, so home is the first place, work is the second place, and then there's the third place, right? Where, I believe Micah kind of expressed what that third place can be. And when I did a little investigation, I felt like I created a third space inadvertently with an aerial class that I've taught for like a decade. And it was a safe space for queer people, for Black people, for people of color, for people with disabilities, for people who were told that they were too fat to do aerial, people who were told they were too old to go upside down, people, all the things. So that kind of excited me that I felt like, ooh, this unknown space, I've already kind of, created it intrinsically, just through my spirit and just, what needed to happen, I made happen. So that was kind of very exciting. And
So we're gonna go back to like our specific project in a few minutes, but right now, this is awesome. So I think that this is what you were just talking about is exactly it, which is sort of like, did we know what third space was? Were we seeking it out with the language? Were we seeking it out just naturally without the language, right? And so what Cabley ended up looking up and what we've sort of spoken to, and something that I wanted to bring up is if you do hear these terms, a lot of people now use them interchangeably. I have a background in social science, so I kind of know these two, and I also still use them interchangeably. The two links that I put in the chat are going to tell you a little bit about the sort of like roots of the two. Whereas third place kind of has a little bit of a more general, as we were just speaking about, work, home, third place. Third space, socioculturally as a theory, has to do a little more explicitly around the idea of a space that has the potential for sort of revolutionary action. So there is a distinction between those two in the way that they were originally coined. However, in sort of like more common parlance, they've really overlapped. And I think that part of the reason for that is because when we're talking about that third place often takes on that third space potential in the way that it's theorized. And so I'm a person who kind of feels like, I mean, that not only feels like, but language is an always evolving thing, right? And so for the space and place of our night tonight, we can call it third place, we can call it third space. We're going to use those things interchangeably. But I do think it's helpful for us to have an awareness that like there was a distinction between those two terms, and you'll find some really good links to kind of dive into those in the chat if you want to. So what I wanted to ask these esteemed guests is, as Cabley started digging into a little bit, where did you or had you like where can you like locate in your own story like an initial feeling or need for queered spaces? And we're going to go into like what does queering mean, but where for you, whether it was as a child or later in your life, can you remember sort of like places in which you felt that need for a third place that maybe didn't exist? Whether it was inside yourself, whether it was outside, like where can you really sort of locate a moment where you're like, I need this thing, this other thing, and maybe I can't name it, right? And, did you then feel like you had the capacity to build it? Did you identify other people who were building it? And we'll go a little bit into sort of like examples of other places that we've found. But I think what I'm really looking for is sort of whether this is more of like a personal feeling or in terms of like your own growing up environment, school, family, etc. Like, where did you start to identify that there might be like another space that maybe didn't exist for you that you were seeking out or wanted to build?
I mean, I guess I can jump in quickly, and I will say, I guess I will trouble or queer the question a little bit, because I didn't have to seek it out. I grew up the son of a preacher man. Church was my context. I was in Northeast Ohio. I realized that this is far from everyone or even many queer person's experience, but church was a place where a very, very obviously and extravagantly queer child, was embraced in all of my queerness. There was a safe place for me to land. And I think in all the ways that we just explained, third space and third place, it was where I landed outside of a school where I was bullied, and a home where I was also really very much embraced, but where it was kind of, with a family that I felt, was still trying to find their way into, how to figure out what exactly I was becoming. But church was absolutely a place where, I felt like I was welcomed and celebrated. And so, when I came to New York City, I was going to study theater and theology, and when I found queer community, because there wasn't any word for it when I was growing up. In church, I felt celebrated, but nobody was saying sort of like, "Hey, seek out these things to read because I think that you might need this book, or this might give you language for yourself." I didn't have that. I just had love. And so when I came to New York City, found queer community, I was like, "That's the thing. Nobody told me that existed as well." And so I thought, unfortunately, at that moment, I've got to go toward queer community and I'm going to drop church. But fortunately, after a few years, not only did I find out that there are actually like queer places where they're approaching faith in the form of a question, like the place where I work right now, but also when I tentatively kind of came out to my father, who I was terrified of because he was a minister. My father basically said, "Thank you so much for catching up. I've been waiting for you. I have been reading books. I have been, watching films. I've been seeking out education. So I'm ready for you to live your life. So please be ready to live your life." And that to me actually was a third space in that moment. He crafted a third space because he was queering himself. My dad is as sort of straight as you can come, but I actively watched my straight father queer himself and decide to be the landing space, that third space for me. So I didn't necessarily know I needed it. I didn't know I was seeking it out, but my dad kind of extravagantly created it in front of me. And that got me back to, I guess, the church, because I got a job at one now.
I feel like Micah sort of led us here a little, but maybe we should do the what is queering. Micah also used one of my favorite verbs, which we don't all know is a verb, but troubling. So let's do it again. I'm asking you, audience, and you're welcome to speak up, but you can also put it in the chat. What does it mean to you to queer as a verb? We can also add, what does it mean to trouble as a verb? And I have a great link for it, but does anyone want to have a go? Not you, Micah, you just spoke and you kind of said it already. And I know that you have an answer. I'm going to start with you. Queering. What does it mean to queer something as a verb? Is this a word we use? If you're at Judson, you hear it said all the time. Judson folks, I know you do. Capely, what do you think? Queering as a verb?
Yeah, to queer, not binary, to yeah, to live your authentic self. Yeah, I looked at the link. I know, queering, it feels very, not word salad. It's just very, there's a word for everything. Yeah, I'm gonna let somebody else jump in.
Yeah, it's interesting because queer as a verb, it's interesting for me because I think I had a very unusual background in that my father lived at the Playboy Mansion in Chicago with Hugh Hefner, and I spent probably my first 5 years on the road with him and my family in the Playboy circuit, which was a thing at that point. I'm 66, so in those days it was like a Club Med type of thing, and they were all over. And I think for me, what was interesting about the Playboy scene was that so many of the women that lived in the mansion, in particular in Chicago, were queer and were playmates of the year. So it was like this weird. For me, I think I just very early on was sort of overwhelmed with questions without answers. And I'm grateful for those questions because, the structure of that environment, which is sort of like the epicenter of misogyny in every way, in many ways anyway, made it impossible for me anyway to not seek out spaces where people could be authentic in who they were and not feeling the pressure to be performative for any reason. Because I think that environment was so drastically performative and frankly extremely abusive, so it was just an interesting. I think for me, I can't separate out how I think about these things in the way people get labeled or caught up or not accepted or accepted for various performative elements of their genders. And so for me, the whole thing was so, it was always complicated, like so many of the women that I met in my early childhood who were very successful playmates or bunnies or whatever, all of that, were queer, completely not interested in any other kind of lifestyle. So it was completely like something put on. And so that just, I think, I don't know if that is at all helpful, but I think for me, the idea of queering as a verb is new, but I think I have lived most of my life really seeking out spaces where people can be themselves and not be forced into any particular role, if that makes sense.
Totally. There's some amazing answers here in the chat. Coming in hot, one of my students, Stella, says, to me, queer as a verb acts as a way to break the normative perceptions of self and community. Micah has given us a quote from St. Bell Hooks. Queer not as in being about who you're having sex with, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and thrive and live. And if you come to Judson, St. Bell Hooks is on the wall with our queer saints. Beautiful work from Jason Sang. Sarah says, approach something in a more expansive way outside the traditional and normative. And Severin adds, I think of it as shifting my perspective from what is standardized to include something that feels more inclusive, right? So from the quote, from the link that I gave you guys, it gives you a little bit of sort of like the context from which people sort of started using this, or like that it started kind of moving. And, I think it's a really interesting thing, and I probably have mentioned this in each of these roundtables, but, in Hooks, who talks about, theory as a liberatory practice, right? We think about the idea of, for her and for me, going to the library was a third space. The library is an amazing third space, and the library was a hugely queer third space for me because it was a place where I was exposed to ideas and people and ways of being in the world that were not available in my life, in my community, in my family. And I learned through writers and the people they wrote about all these different possibilities for myself. And it was really in books and in the library, because it was free and I was poor, what I could be. And, and this is really what Hooks talks about in Theory as a Liberatory Practice. And so I think for her, for me, for a lot of us who kind of like, theory wasn't something that we found in school. We found it in the library when we escaped our home and escaped school, and it saved our lives. And it gives us other ways to see the world. And so for me, thinking is an intensely human practice. And, today is Rock Dalton's birthday. And Rock Dalton is an incredible poet who wrote a well, it's in Spanish, but it's poetry like bread is for everyone. And I think the same thing about theory, right? So these are really, they're just things that humans do, right? Thinking is a thing that humans do. Art is a thing that humans do. Making systems is a thing that humans do. And now we've named it all of these things, right? But actually, they're just things that humans do. We make language and then we move it around. And so it doesn't have anything to do with school. We've said that it does, but it doesn't. Of course, we make the schools, and we can also say it's not where it happens, right? It happens in our own world and it happens on the internet. And so, yes, so queer as an activist framework function as a verb, and it says here, it challenged the dominance of heterosexist discourse, blah, 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 right? But it also comes from like that original way that queer was used as a slur even, right? Queer being the strange, queer being the other, queer being the not normative, right? And so when we queer things, we say, I want to be a Playboy bunny all the time, right? Like, and, so there are, and I think I often, within queer and gay circles, I will often also say, like, there are many people who are gay who now are doing very normative things, especially in a United States and in a world where you can be more normal and live in sort of like capitalist normative life and not be queer because of the way that laws have changed, right? And so like the queering of queerness is an interesting question as well, as it's more possible to like not have to be radical to be a gay person, right? And as that quote from Hooks, right? Like you could be having sex with someone of the same gender and be a total like capitalist normative person. That doesn't necessarily make you queer, right? So queering is a really interesting word, and the way that we use it to describe people is interesting, right? All right, so we're going to come back to our questions. And so my next question for these folks, right, has to do with kind of like, how did your need for queered spaces or third places or spaces, how did this influence sort of the choices that you made? Or that you're making now? And how do you feel like this relates to sort of your role, whether it's the role that you officially have or the role that you say that you have, and kind of the mediums that you use, right? Like, I think that one of the things that I was really interested in having this conversation tonight was sort of like, we're talking about care in a certain way. And I brought the idea of care in because I do see the building of third spaces, especially when we decide that they're going to be interdependent and for other people, as an act of care, not only for ourselves, but for others, right? And so what does it mean to queer as an act of care? What does it mean to queer as an act of survival, right? And so how did that kind of need, that instinct, whether you named it or not, how do you see that sort of relating to the road that you took or are taking? And anyone can jump in. And lovely audience, I love everything you're saying. If this like inspired something in you, put it there and raise your hand. We'll let you in.
I think I'm going to jump in just to kind of complete that thought I was talking about earlier about how I kind of created my own third space out of necessity without even realizing what it is, and thereby creating a safe space for other people who I think have been foraging around for community. And this was at a circus space where you would think like circus, everybody's included. We're all, freaky deaky. We're all wild. We're all different and strange. But white supremacy, has, a fog over everything. And so that was not the case. And so, when I entered that arena, it was, a breath of fresh air or something new. I queered it. I queered it. I made it Black. I made it I made it, non-binary, the whole thing. And so, it felt like accessibility to me, places that you would think are accessible weren't. And so, here I am creating this space, and then also creating a platform for people, Black trans people, to have a platform to write. I've also conducted writing workshops. That's another one of my mediums where people who typically are not able to share their narratives have a space and a place to do so, and are celebrated for it and are encouraged to share those things. And this is all about freedom to me. And what did Audre Lorde say? The function of freedom is to free someone else, free others, something like that. Yeah. So there's a ripple effect. And so I just feel that these spaces were lost a lot, during the pandemic. A lot of them were lost. And I think that now we're seeking to find these again. And because we do need to survive, and we need to survive in community and not alone, and to find people with similar interests and places where we feel safe, that's gonna make all the difference.
Other guests?
I mean, I guess I can speak specifically. First of all, I love what was just said. So thank you, Kaylee. I mean, this gets very specific to my own situation, but to further unfold from what I was describing about my father and what Eli you shared in the chat, it took a while to realize that this queering of himself that my father did was not what all parents did, whether they were inside the church or not inside the church. So I have taken it upon myself. I call it soul repair, but I think that it is my duty. Actually, with the quotation that Kaylee you just brought up, because I had such an enthusiastic embrace by my father, who was a pastor, by the church that I was a part of. And it took me coming to New York City and actually having LGBTQ people showing up at the door and telling me that they had just come from their church that, was telling them they needed an exorcism. It quickly gave me an education in the fact that my experience was very different from a lot of other people's experiences, especially in the church. So that put me into this fierce road toward my soul repair, calling, which is that I think that it is my duty to be the one who welcomes somebody in and says, you do not need an exorcism. There's a whole crop of other things in the world that need exorcisms. There's a whole crop of other evil acts in the world that need to be dismantled. You are perfectly queer. You are perfect in every single glittery cell of your body. And so for me, I've actively watched that be a queering for someone in a moment. I think that even seeing young queer people walk into church, whether it be for an arts event, whether it be for a Sunday morning service, or whether it be for an organizing meeting, and having me introduce the space, looking at the fingernails, looking at, the other obviously queer aspects of me, and having me be introduced as the senior minister of an active church, I've watched it actively disorient. I've watched it actively pave a horizon for other folks. And I think that is my duty. I will die, fighting for people to better understand that their queerness is actually as close as they can get to having a sacred experience of any kind of divine, whatever that mystery is. So I'm so grateful that basically I haven't had to create those spaces for myself. And I basically feel like I have to continually open myself up to understanding that because I have had all of these privileges for reasons that are probably obvious, visually to folks who can see me right now, but also for other reasons, I think that the continual act of queering myself each day is a decision that while there are many ways that particularly white, gay, and lesbian people can assimilate and lean into all the marriage equality that they want to, that it is my duty to look back and say, who are we leaving behind in all of these assimilation moves? Who are we leaving behind? That to me is a continual querying, especially as certain people in the initialism are given rights and given invitations to assimilate into a straighter, more heteronormative culture.
Yeah, I really appreciate your mentioning there this idea of the divine mystery. And I think for me, where I first felt a sense of safety in kind of my own identity and my own peculiarities of perspective was in the theater. And I think, you know, the theater community was one that I sought out when I was really, you know, truthfully, when I was in third or fourth grade. And then that just continued to be very much a part of my life, and it remains so. So I think, you know, for me, the theater is the space in which these sort of divine mysteries are explored in a communal space where everyone is welcome. You know, I mean, obviously, the world isn't always perfect, but the idea, and I've been fortunate to be working in part of and starting companies, founding companies in which people really were welcomed, that there was a sense of inclusion, and the questions that were being asked about the sort of divine mysteries of life, but also the world and the power structures of the world, were really deeply challenged through these theater practices. And for me, you know, theater, the practice of theater is an embodiment practice. It's about embodying other than yourself, understanding other than your own specific experience, and often really challenging. At its best, I think it challenges some of the restrictive, sort of heteronormative constraints that the world continues to operate in. And the theater world was just an open world where all sorts of different kinds of people came together in a way that felt very empowering and joyful. So I feel, for me, the theater saved me in that sense. It was like, okay, here I feel like I'm in a healthy, real, truthful, and open third space, I guess would be the language I would use. So for me, that was a big piece of where I found myself seeking out a space which allowed freedom, like, you know, you were saying, right? Freedom, this idea of freedom in that space. And, you know, as I now am in my 60s and have worked in the theater all of my life, really, and run theaters and been involved in different situations producing, I think, you know, it's a challenging moment for theater, and one that's important. It's not perfect, and there's just so much about it that you realize as you go along, as is true in any institutional kind of structure, is very repressive in its own way. And so I think for me, in the past few years in particular, I've been really interested in kind of unpacking a lot of the norms that are in the theater world, and looking and excavating, understanding how they are creating a lot of the same things that, you know, that they were trying to fight against. So anyway, I don't know if that makes any sense, but for me, theater saved me in this sense. Yeah.
April, you looked like you were maybe about to respond.
Oh, yeah, I know. My face says it all. Yeah, I don't know if I'm really going to respond, but more, I don't know what all I was going to say is that, I have a very different feeling about theater, but I think it's, whatever. But what I wanted to really say is that, so taught, whatever, aerial rope, like whatever you climb up, you climb up the thing and you wrap it around your body and you do all tricks and whatever. And, looks beautiful. It's hard to do. The rope doesn't care if you're Black. The rope doesn't care if you're poor. The rope doesn't care if you have, you know what I mean? Like theater does care. Theater. So I'll just leave that there. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. That's right.
I find myself thinking about the ways that we learn to be performative, not only in the theater. And something that I've been writing about a lot and thinking about a lot right now is just the ways that, and I, even in social science, there's a lot of really interesting writing and thinking about sort of like social performance, like the performance that we do every day, right? And so I think in a way, it's interesting the ways that sometimes like theater or the act of theater or the act of something like drag or learning how to sort of like perform saves us and then also maybe prevents us from moving. I mean, it prevents us from certain types of growth because it allows us to sort of like participate, whether or not we acknowledge that that's what we're doing. I've been thinking a lot about masking as like a neurodivergent person, not knowing that I was doing that, but then also sort of really wanting to dig in to just sort of the ways that all of us kind of learn social codes and mores, right? And sort of like where we learn that it's safe to queer ourselves, where we learn that it isn't safe to queer ourselves, whether we sort of learn that there is a space that we can do that in, and how much we acknowledge or name or are sort of aware of this or articulate it or make it a practice. I think now that I kind of came into an awareness of what, is understood as like neurodivergence, like in my 40s, really like in my late 30s and early 40s, understanding being like, oh, like that was the thing that I was doing, but isn't everybody doing it? Like, yes, but also maybe not to the extent that I was. How does that intersect with something like gender, sexuality, our expression of our sexuality? How much did we feel like, from the question from survival to sanctuary, right? Like, how much did we feel like performing expectations around any of these things, around identity, around race, around class, around, I have a totally different accent that I had when I was growing up. There's a great video on the internet, I can show it to all of you, where I do not speak like this. I did not speak like this. My family does not speak like this. And people will be like, are you from Canada? I'm like, first of all, this is not a Canadian accent, but also like, no, I'm not from Canada. I'm also not from the Midwest. I'm from education. I'm from academia. I learned words on paper before I heard them out loud because I was reading to myself late at night as a 10-year-old. You know what I'm saying? Like, I am the product of all of these things, and I am the product of performing it well. I'm the product of being adjacent to privilege and learning exactly how to move in those spaces. And it was so much more important to me to do that perfectly because I was not supposed to be in those spaces. So I needed to perform it in ways that someone who actually belongs there or is accepted there doesn't really necessarily have to learn. But that means that I am, you don't know, right? Like, I'm so good at it that you're never going to know that those things don't belong to me because I'm very good at drag, right? Because I am a performer, because I am an artist, because I am a theatrical person, and because there's no blurring, there's no edge. It happens all the time. It happens all day long. I started wearing glasses like 15 years before I ever needed glasses because and I'll explain this to people. I'm like, my character wears glasses. I do set design. I do costume design. That character wears glasses, obviously, right? And so it's sort of like we're all participating in these various ways of like performing ourselves, right? And for so many of us, I do think it saved us, but it did help us participate in sort of survival mechanisms that maybe we weren't necessarily choosing, right? Okay, so looking at the time, bringing us back, a couple of different things. So our question, I was going to kind of move us into something a little bit of like, I'm thinking of like the micro questions, the meso questions, the sort of the middle range questions. So a little bit about sort of like our fields, like the ways that we teach, the communities and lineages that we find ourselves in. Specifically, something that I've been asking in all of these series has to do with kind of like how we interface with, and this has come up already, of course, like how we interface with or build or refuse or trouble institutions, right? What does this mean for us in our first and second spaces? Are we dissociating? Are we being like, I do this in this space, so I don't have to do it over there, right? Like, do we kind of, how much do we divide ourselves? We have a safe place over here. Do we have that so that we don't have to bring that person home? Do we bring that person home for Thanksgiving? Do we say to our racist uncle that they're a racist uncle, or do we get along, right? Do we perform, right? And keep that somewhere else, right? So this is an interesting thing to me. I'm interested in the ways that where we do push back, where we refuse. I'm gonna throw something in the chat because Micah's exercise comment made me think a couple of years ago when I was making the speculative solidarity videos, I was really into the idea of like exorcism and how we could exercise energetically from ourselves. So I did this thing called an exercise. So I'm going to put that in the chat for you. But I'm interested for us in sort of like, there is an exorcism here. There's sort of like, how did I like pull myself, save myself from these places, but then we still kind of are in them, right? So like, how do you interface? Like, how is that working for you now? How has that worked for you in the past? Yeah. And also like, how is this showing up in your work? Have you learned it from others? Like, are there people you particularly want to sort of be like, that person modeled that for me, and that's been everything, right? So I know there's many questions, and I can also exercises in the chat, but I can also put these questions that I'm asking the nice people in the chat. They have these questions already. It's in your run of show, but I'll put it in the chat as well, right? So have you been part of this, led this, learned this? How does it show up in your work? How does it show up in your teaching, etc.? I will put it. You're welcome. Too many questions combined. I know. Sorry. Neurodivergent brain over here, it's like an explosion. I have like 8,000 questions in every one question, but it's just how it happens in the brain. So welcome to my brain. This is why I said this a couple of hours ago.
Well, I can take a little stab at it, a little jump in. I think for me, I think I've gotten better at trusting myself when I confront things within whatever environment I'm in, whether it's an academic environment, and or the theater worlds that I've been in and worked in. And, in confronting things that I feel lack equity, lack the kind of values that are important to me, when I have confronted those things in those settings, I have gotten a lot of pushback. I mean, really hard, heavy, silencing, gaslighting, ostracizing, silencing. And I think the only thing I can say is that I've just gotten better at coexisting with the fact that that's going to happen when I do take a stand on things, something that I have always done. So it's just, I feel like it makes room for a different kind of space, and I'm getting better at really trusting that more, and being able to walk away from things that I feel are not practicing modalities that I feel are really important to me. And so I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's currently, I have just been just fiercer in my own determination to not back away from really challenging or disagreeing with the way things are being done. And that happens to me. And in Bennington is a wonderful environment in many ways, but it's also, as a teacher there for 23 years, there are lots of ways in which I'm continually challenging the norms and paying the price for that in ways that I feel right now I don't regret. And similarly in theater, I ran a theater for 14 years and I resigned and walked away from it because I felt the value systems, the power structures that were in place were really, really toxic and not what I want to do with my life. So I think for me, is a point in trusting that, sometimes you just have to take those stands, and there may be an immediate result that is challenging, but really worth it. So I guess I've been a bit of a revolutionary lately. That's been my current mode. And all the things that come with that, and I'm now beginning to have a sense of humor again after the past few years of being battered a bit around. And that's not a bad thing. So I'm grateful for all of it somehow.
It was certainly the right time for Dina and I to cross paths because we have been on the same channel. So obviously, Kapely and Micah, you are invited to respond, but I'm also going to extend this question to my students because all of these students have been working in ways, and I can speak to it, but have been working in ways that sort of have invited them to and asked them to explore sort of what it means to make things, whether in physical spaces that are sort of like liminal in institutions, right? So how to activate sort of passing spaces, how to do sort of like installation, or how to engage with academic buildings in a way that creates sort of like an unexpected experience that people engage with, and it changes the nature of that space, right? Like the seed lab, which was like installed in Kappa, like in what would otherwise be a rather formal sort of like sitting area in a building that's like made of marble, like the most expensive building in Vermont, right? So, and then suddenly there's like a bulletin board and all of this and all of these like test tubes and weird, and pieces of tree and you know what I mean, and all these like tools and books and things for you to engage with, right? And so, students invited to do that or to create sort of reading rooms like within a library, like about Palestine and Israel, and and sort of like bringing zine fairs into a gallery space, right? So these students have been working in all these ways that kind of say they are all interested in asking these questions. So students, you are welcome to raise your hands or talk about this. Otherwise, I will just speak on your behalf. Something that I can say is that Santiago, who's not here, unfortunately, has been having such a really interesting experience because they became really interested in the idea of building what's known as a time bank. And I don't know if that's something that folks are familiar with, but a time bank is sort of, it can be done digitally and physically. And I have been training them on sort of like different open source software where you can build it online. And so we've been talking about building a time bank for Bennington, and basically what, Keen, I see your hand. And basically like how a time bank often works is it kind of is a bartering system for a community. You can do services, but also goods. It can be a place where it's sort of like, I can tutor you, but I need help, learning how to fix my car or whatever. But it can also be sort of something that the students have been really interested in, is sort of like creating spaces for kids that craft or make things, to sort of like sell and trade and be aware of what other kids are making. And so Santiago's been going through this process of both sort of learning the logistics of actually physically building this, both online and off, but then navigating the very real reality of people being extremely enthusiastic and then them building the thing and then like sending out the thing and then being like, oh, people aren't using it. What happens when I send out this thing? And they made a zine and they made a form and they were great. And they were sort of like, there's so much enthusiasm. And then sort of like, what do we do when we build infrastructures that people want? And then they don't necessarily like utilize them, right? It's sort of like 1 million people want to come to an event and then 5 of the 200 that sign up, you know what I mean? It's sort of like, what do we do in a time when people are so overwhelmed And so much, I think, of what my students have been learning, and I've really tried to stress, and the students who are here who've been working on the publication know the same thing. For any of us who've worked in the arts or in, building third spaces, half the lesson is about how to actually get people to do it. Like the actual, like, make the theater is only part of the actual lesson. A lot of it is actually like how to physically get the space, how to get people into seats, how to, you know what I mean? How to, so that learning is actually so much of it. Keen, did you want to actually say something and speak, or do you want to put something in the chat? You are welcome to speak or even come on camera.
I did want to say, because I was struck by what Tina was saying about, the question of principles and values. And I mean, when I go through my life, I see things all the time that I want to change. It's just part of maybe what I loved what you said, Eli, about welcome to my brain. Well, my brain says there should be a better way right here. And this is even in petty things like how people stand in line at McDonald's. I mean, it's like they really should, but I think not my job. But I wanted to say two things. One of them is I really would like to hear from everybody how they choose when to be performative in the way that our culture has made us be performative and not push back against things that are not the way we want them, and when not to, how you choose which ways. And I wanted to say I have sort of two things beyond my basic values and all that, but two specific things. One of them is not to do it alone, which is, what are the other people thinking? What do they want to do? Is this something that belongs not just to me, but to other people? Because that often actually curbs me into thinking, this is just one of my crazinesses. I'm not going there by myself. But that is one thing. And the other thing is it's somehow energizing or fun. So I'm at the moment doing a whole project in my mind about reorganizing the way the chairs are in the classrooms at Bronx Community College where I teach, which is, not changing the world so much, although I quickly can figure out why it's the best way for education of the world. But I know that's a little crazy. But it's fun for me. I mean, I really want to figure out how to get the administration to understand a better way to set up classrooms. I've already got my students trained.
Keen, I love what you're adding. I have so many things I could say about how our classrooms are set up as someone who's been teaching for 20 years. I'm gonna loop us back into the speakers and one of my students who wants to say something, and then in a couple minutes we're gonna open up to Q&A. But thank you for jumping in, Keen. I really appreciate you being willing to come on and share some thoughts.
I appreciate you too for opening it up.
Of course. So I'm going to invite Will on for a second. And so Will, who was not here when we were introducing students before, is a student who is a graduating senior who is leaving Bennington soon at the end of the semester, but who has been involved in local politics as well in Vermont and has been doing research on rural politics and rural communities in Vermont, and I think has had a very interesting and unique experience working at that intersection of actually working in an official capacity already, being secretary for the Vermont Dems and working as Justice for the Peace in Bennington. And so I think that Will has had a really unique experience, because when you start to work in government, when you're already in school and work in community, it changes what you understand about your education, right? And I think that, and has also made some really great zines and stuff with me about being, about how to engage community in these conversations. And so I'm going to let Will talk a little bit about their work.
Yeah, I mean, you really did a good job summarizing that, Eli. I do want to mention when we say leaving Bennington, I mean the college, not the town. I'm still going to stay here after graduation, just in case there's anyone here that was wondering that. But I definitely want to help out with the college even after I graduate. I think the big thing I've picked up on in this conversation, just because like we're talking about queering spaces and community spaces, I think one of the big things for me, and I'll just relate it because it happened very recently, but when I was abroad, I was at an international conference where people from all over the world came, and we got to talk about, global politics, but also about our own individual countries and regions. And so I was very excited to represent Vermont there and America. But while I was there, it was one of the few times where I've been in a room and really could tell that my presence kind of was different, but it was also welcomed. And that I think I just was thinking about that a lot because I think oftentimes, and again, this isn't about queer people per se, but also I've taken that as someone who is gay into account, that a lot of people don't go into spaces like that because they don't see themselves or they think that it's not built for them or meant for them. But I think in a way, instead of, going into a situation and trying to challenge it or change it, I look as just adding myself to that. And I think if everyone just looked at it as they're adding themselves to a conversation or adding themselves to a space, I think it would be a much more positive outlook on the way we do things and how we queer those spaces. So that was kind of what I wanted to say. But yeah, I think Eli's also right that it has shaped my education drastically. And I'm happy to take any questions. And sorry, I was in the restroom because I think the lack of sleep and the sleep deprivation is really getting to my system now. So that is a fun thing to deal with after traveling. Thank you.
Appreciate you, Will. I'm actually going to also bring Stella on to talk a little bit about the experiences of the group that has been working on the Free Press and that previously was working on sort of urgent actions around Palestine with me in the fall and who is continuing to do so at Bennington. And Stella's agreed to speak a little bit, but Abby and Molly, if you want to join in, you're welcome as well.
Yeah, something you had mentioned previously about like Santiago's time bake and like really struggling with prior enthusiasm versus after. I feel like that's something we really struggled with as well. I think in our processes of creating the Bennington Free Press and also like working on the zines and stuff, I think something I really came to, and I think as a group we can agree that it was really hard to not let like a lot of the diplomatic processes or like life experiences break our spirit. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people run into while creating like queered spaces, is that often like our outside influences and like financial reasons and life reasons in totality, like they can really break you and make you feel that you can't exist in queer spaces and you can't create these queer spaces. And I think that's something that we really struggled with. And I think like, coming from a lot of different backgrounds, it's been really interesting and like, an experience to learn how to create a WordPress, for instance. Like we didn't know any of these things and it was very confusing. And like how time like management feels and like really time sensitive matters, and stuff like that. Like learning to balance your personal life and your personal mental health while also really believing in something that's current.
Thank you, Stella. I know that it's been a real challenge like over the last couple of semesters to work on these issues at a really small college like Bennington as well, and where the sort of like institutional setup of the college is really unusual in terms of like the way that people's programs work. Abby or Molly, do either of you want to jump on and say anything? No pressure.
I just was thinking like it's interesting to be doing this work here because like in the like thinking within the context of queering third spaces, because we live here and we go to school here, so it's already our first and second place. And I do feel like the conversations we've been having about our process creating the Free Press have kind of been like related to this idea of trying to find like space for it and space for our ideas within the campus, and just like our frustrations around feeling so isolated in this place, and like feeling like there's nowhere like to go once we step off this campus. And so having to create the space within the campus that is, it's just like, it's funny because like that third space has to be within the first and the second space, but I think like it is definitely possible. It's just yeah, it's definitely necessary, I think, for the work we're trying to do. That's not a very fully formed thought, but that's just what I was thinking about while we were having this conversation.
No, definitely. And I'm glad that you brought that part up, Molly. I think that, something that, especially at a place that's so small like Bennington, and like you're saying, right, it's so insular, right? It's such a kind of like bubble for better or worse. And, for anyone who's not familiar with Bennington, it really is like, it is an open campus, but it is in a sort of like semi-rural area. It's not really, it's not in a city, it's not really in a town. I mean, you can walk to sort of a small village, but it's very small. And otherwise there's like strip malls there, sort of surrounded by sort of this area of kind of like semi-rural Vermont. And the students are all sort of there, and we have an incredibly high population of like trans and gay students, and also enormous like population of international students, people of color, that we've brought into this like very white, extremely sort of like, in a way, sort of right-wing gun carrying area of Vermont. Right. And it is very sort of visible and vocal in its sort of like radicalness. And I think the students are very aware of being visible, and students who then are deciding to do queerer, more radical things are extremely aware of becoming even more visible, right, in ways that can feel very unsafe. And so that is a real concern. And so thank you for bringing that up, Molly. So I'm going to mark us at time. So we are at 9:06, and I want to just say that, as I always like to do in these conversations, I like to let them flow. But something that I had wanted to ask our guests, and that I want to give you an opportunity to do before we leave, is to sort of like speak to, examples from your practices. I was thinking, Capely, specifically about, the show that you just were part of at Jack, and some of the other projects that I know that each of you have done that might sort of speak to, bringing us back to from survival to sanctuary. I think we've all kind of had, in a way, like a personal conversation and talked a little bit about how it worked like in theater, or, but I would love to kind of ask us to dive a little more just specifically into our own personal like practices, something that you're working on right now, something that you worked on recently, and sort of the next step, right? Like, what is this looking like for you right now? Where can you see this going? Like, what is on your mind right now about like where you're taking your practice? Is there something that you've done recently that you feel like demonstrates that for you? Yeah, where are you going from here? And then in about 10 minutes or so, we'll open it up for more questions. So I don't know if, Capely, you wanted to jump because I sort of called on you, but I had, I have in my mind.
Yeah, you called on me, Eli. It's all good. Yeah, so I did this really beautiful, I was part of this beautiful piece at Jack called Midair for some time. And it was a piece that was about connection and accessibility, emotional release. There was technology involved where it vibrated to a film, the emotional quality of what was happening in the film, and also just things that were happening that could vibrate. And there was this really poignant moment where myself and the other performer, we're both queer people, we're both non-binary people, we're both people of color, where we asked the audience if we had consent to touch their arm. And this moment of touch and connection would be accompanied by a light change and a cello bowing. And it was really this moment where you could say yes or no to invite in this moment. You know, are you curious enough to experience what it might be like to have somebody who you know, very queer looking, very, you know, and ancestral and sacred, you know, with gold body paint and whatnot. And so that was a beautiful kind of experience where people open themselves up to something new and sensually decadent, that kind of shifted their perspectives and consciousness, I'm pretty sure. And it's probably kind of the most important work I've been doing, this installation. And so, you know, there's something about being able to connect with people in all modalities, whether it's through light or sound or touch, uh, smell, using all the senses. And it really just kind of strips us down to our, you know, to our pure senses. And so I'd love to do more of that work, you know, especially being like a trans person and just being a healer. I just really believe that, you know, we're really special. And so that's part of our magic and like kind of what we were born to do, or like what we're here on this earth to do. And so, you know, continuing with that legacy, you know, you know, everything I do, I feel is for the future. It's for, you know, it's for the next young non-binary gender expansive person, person of color, look, you know, so they can see possibility. So other than continuing with this installation, I'd also like to do some more writing, to have more narratives of of people that maybe I'm curious about, you know, and or that other people are curious about. I can write about my own experience that maybe people don't understand, and just to kind of tell a very specific story, to actually tell a very general story, and to really kind of show how similar we actually all are. And that's my dream. That's my dream. And I do want to say, you know, part of me, if I sounded kind of flippant about like, queering the spaces, whatever, you know, it's words. I think because I've just been so queer my whole life, like I just can't get away from it. You know, you know, safety is always on my mind. This is it, you know, so yes. So, but I think they're very important spaces to have, and I relish creating them and being part of them. Thank you.
Micah or Dina, and also audience, lovely audience, please throw questions in the chat or raise your hand as we come towards the sort of end of our time. But Micah or Dina, you're invited to chime back in.
I think I'll just say, I mean, I want to lift up what you just said, Kaylee, because it was a beautiful inspiration and even a sermon for me tonight. So thank you. And I want to also lift up what Severin has said in the chat, because it resonates with me in terms of what I was about to say here, which is, you know, I love the Queering Third Spaces part of the title of this specific aspect of the series, but I also love the From Survival to Sanctuary kind of overarching title. And for me, you know, clearly the word sanctuary for a faith leader who has a physical space has a certain connotation. So we have a sanctuary, which funnily enough at Judson, we don't call a sanctuary, we call it the meeting room, because we're that allergic sometimes to calling things a sanctuary. But I think that very much like what you've said, Severin, in the chat here, I like to think of us embodying sanctuary, that especially when we found out that cities declaring themselves sanctuary cities actually had no actual teeth to it, that when push came to shove, that sanctuary cities through our immigrant neighbors completely under the bus and didn't set up systems to hold them, I started to think, well, what does it mean to actually say you're a sanctuary city anymore? There's actually no there's no system to care that you as a city or as the municipal folks, claiming it as a sanctuary city. There's nothing actually behind what you've said. So when I watched that happen, I started to think, like, what does it mean to kind of think about not being walls as people and instead being sanctuaries as people? And I think that there is a true queering there, that if you go through life understanding yourself as a sanctuary, understanding other bodies as sanctuary, what does that call you actually toward? When you stop thinking of sanctuaries as just being third spaces that you're sitting within, but instead your own body and soul as it moves through the world and through your life, what does that call you toward? And I would say that it calls you toward deep, deep love of yourself and for one another, and constant questions of how consent, as Kipperly was saying, how we touch one another, how we approach one another, how we listen to one another, how we ask questions of one another, how we stay curious about one another, how we dismantle kind of the outer empires that then cause inner empires inside us, and instead meet those inner empires with inner sanctuaries. So that's sort of on my mind, and thankfully I get to work those things out on a Sunday morning, and I like to say that I preach in the form of a question. So I am blessed to have that, but tonight has really reminded me that there are folks really wanting to dive in to figuring out what it means to queer ourselves and to lean into embodying sanctuary ourselves, as opposed to thinking of third spaces as just being things that you sit within. Instead, we are living third spaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Micah. I just want to say one quick thing, Dina. I think that, the idea of us being sanctuary, like, we're doing it right now. And I think one of the reasons that, even though, sure, we're not, for many of us, think that, the pandemic is over, though a lot of friends in the disability community would tell us otherwise, right? But digital spaces have been third spaces for me for a very long time, because I have been someone who's explored the idea of the internet as sort of an atopic or utopic space, meaning literally not utopia, not a geographic place, something that allows us to sort of sit above the restrictions of geographies, of bodies, of institutions, and be in this other space together, right? And so it's actually, I've been exploring spaces like this. We are in a third space. We have made a third space with our bodies and our minds and ourselves tonight, and we're using this platform to be very accessible. We're creating an archive of these questions that lives. It has a long arm. I like to think of the archive as a long arm. It transcends time space. It makes it more accessible. Again, working with ways to make the forms, the media, accessible to other bodies, other brains, and different time spaces, right? And so the one thing that I wanted to bring, and I know Mike and I have spoken about this, to the question of like becoming sanctuary, and queering ourselves. And, Capely, you were talking before a little bit about sort of theater and safety and how we feel safe in institutions. And my students are talking about this too, right? How do we learn to become sanctuary for someone else? How do we get into that, right? Like, what does it look like not to have the intention to be sanctuary for someone else, but to actually learn what it means to be sanctuary for someone else, if that doesn't look like what it looks for us to have sanctuary, right? And so it's sort of like, if what you need is for someone to listen, for a person who is autistic, for instance, like, that person probably doesn't want you to listen. They probably actually want you to problem solve, or they want you to give feedback. Like, you listening and being kind of like, is probably going to kind of freak them out, right? How do you know what the other person needs? How do you know how to be sanctuary for someone else? And how do we, that sort of the wall welcome, sort of like how do we become these different architectures, right? And I've used the term for many years, like interpersonal infrastructures. So how do you make this infrastructure of and with yourself and with other people consensually when so many of us don't have the language or the skills to have those conversations, right? And so the sort of idea of rupture and repair is something that I think about a lot, right? And where did we learn to have these conversations? Did we learn to have these conversations? How many of us are actually comfortable having these conversations? And that kind of idea of like, do you go home to Thanksgiving and have this hard conversation? Most of us don't, actually. Most of us have learned that part of our survival is to not say these things. And so, like, how do we re-skill ourselves to actually have the hard thing, make people uncomfortable, and have that not be a rupture that is destructive, but the kind of rupture that is like the building of a muscle. You rip the muscle to build the muscle, right? So how do we do that? That's I'm constantly thinking about that, right? Because I'm always like, oh, I want to do this because it's what I want, but that may not be what you want. So how do I know what you want, right? And where do we have that conversation? And for so many of us who've learned to not have the conversation as an act of kindness or of appropriate behavior, how do we start having them? Dina, I know you want to say something. Severin has their hand up, so I'm just gonna. You want to?
Severin has their hand up, so that might be great.
I was gonna call on Severin. All right.
I just want to say that there's like a lot of different ways to listen, and sometimes that means building a space for conversation, and sometimes it means noticing who is the person who doesn't have anyone to talk to in the room. So I think that we can't offer need. What you're saying about not offering need that you know isn't wanted, we can't offer need until we notice that a need is not there, and not everyone wants to speak, and listening doesn't always mean waiting. You know what I mean? It's just, yeah. I think we can't, I think you're right. We can't speak to need unless we know what that need is.
Thank you, Severin. Dina, did you want to chime in?
Oh, yeah, no, my mind is just so full of all these fantastic thoughts. That idea just then about need and listening and speaking to need. Yeah, I guess just I'm not sure what the last question was exactly or where it's moved to, but what I am working on right now is a piece called Gorgeous Nothings, which is a combination of poetry that we're translating from a really wonderful Indian poet, Susham Bedi, who is no longer alive. And her work was always written in Hindi and never translated into English. So some of her colleagues have been translating that work, and we're also pulling poetry from Emily Dickinson. And the piece, Gorgeous Nothings, is really a reflection on sort of the COVID pause that is still with us. And it looks at a lot of those things, you know, this idea that, well, the COVID is over and, you know, the trauma is over, but it just where we are in the world now. So it's working with two actors, collaboratively creating this text, pulling from those two poets as well as their own original writing as well as my own. So that's just what I'm doing right now. But other than listening and being very grateful for all the different things that people have shared tonight, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Sometimes the rhythm of the evening just flows, and now we're sort of like, it's 9:23. It's kind of a natural pause. So what I'm going to just do is I'm going to say, you know, to all of our beautiful audience members, if you have any last thoughts or questions for these beautiful guests or just something that you want to share, I will ask you or invite you to do so. And if no one does, I'm going to surprise someone with asking them to do something right now. But if no one else has something to say, what I would love for us to do is maybe Micah, our resident faith leader, would lead us in a little just sort of coming into our bodies as we leave this space with all these questions, call us to be sanctuary together before we leave for this evening. I did not ask them this ahead of time, but they are usually game for such things. And I would love if they would grace us with that.
Thank you, Eli. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and it leaves me with so many more questions. And for me, that is a true win. So I'm so glad to get to know some of you for the first time and some of you better. And so I invite you. I don't know how you feel about the word prayer. Think of this as a prayer, a blessing, but something we're co-creating together. One thing that I was going to bring up earlier is that, especially in organizing, and especially as a lot of organizers and activists have come to me in real states of burnout, what occurs to me is something that comes from art and mostly choral singing, and the idea of circular breath, the idea that you are a part of a chorus and that voices need to catch their breath. And so you trust, as Keen alluded to earlier, that you are not alone, that you have a chorus around you, and that the sound will continue when you stop to catch your breath. And so I hope that tonight felt like a big breath to all of you. And even as we take our chorus out, I hope that you'll remember to step out and take a breath. So if you feel comfortable, just go ahead and close your eyes. I invite you to take a deep breath in and let it out. And feel that breath and energy build and stretch between us. Take another deep breath in and let it out. And feel that breath and energy spill over and stretch far beyond us. And take another deep breath in and let it out. I invite you to just be present in your body right now. As we think back through the words survival, sanctuary, third, spaces, queer, queering, and allow your breath to just keep coming in and out of your body. And if your eyes are closed, open them and just look at the screen in front of you. These faces, these names that have faces behind them, they are breathing with you. We are embodying sanctuary. We make that choice every day, no matter what other voices try to get in the way of our voices. We are queering ourselves and becoming sanctuary every day. So thank you for doing it with me. Thank you for doing it with one another. I can't wait to see you out there. Keep breathing until we meet again. Thank you, Eli, and thank you all.
Thank you, Micah. So I feel like Micah just closed us out. I'm like, bye. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our wonderful audience. Thank you to my students. Thank you to Kappa and Bennington. Thank you to these incredible guests, to Capely and Dina and Micah. And audience, I would invite you to come on, unmute yourselves, say some words of well-deserved praise for these folks. We so loved having you, and I would invite any of you to sort of be part of these ongoing conversations. I really do want to keep having them in the world, and I hope that you feel invited to be part of it. Not a audience member, but a participant. And it's just been my honor to have you here tonight. And you truly are building sanctuary with me, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you, audience. Thank you, folks.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you, Eli. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all.
I'm going to stop the recording. And so for all of you listening at home, we love you as well.